This afternoon we'll be discussing a history of revolution in the Middle East, which is an impossibly big task. I know there's some people in the room who have been part of revolutions in the Middle East, so I'm looking forward to their contributions. And there is a very, very rich history of revolution, which actually, I think the roots of which come from the very inception of what we know as the modern Middle East today, the Middle East of nation states, which was carved up, squabbled over and plundered by European imperialist colonial powers from its very inception. So what I'm going to sort of narrow in on is the wave of anti-colonial struggles in the 1950s and 60s, which are a source of inspiration, but also a story of bitter betrayal and a lesson in the failures and the limits of Arab nationalism as a politics that can liberate the people. And the consequences of these revolutions rippled right through history and fed directly into the more recent wave of revolutions with the Arab Spring of 2011 and subsequent uprisings as well. And so there's three things that I want to argue. One is that these nationalist struggles led to the emergence of new local native ruling classes, which made their peace with capitalism and imperialism, and in doing so squandered the hopes of the revolutionary, the hopes of the revolutionary masses, ordinary people. This included, making their peace with Israel and the US and turning their backs on the Palestinian people. And I think the failures and the betrayals actually of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, are also products of these nationalist politics. The second argument is that the outcome actually could have been different. Many of these revolutions contained within them the seeds of possibility of a far deeper, more profound and thoroughgoing struggle for total social and economic liberation, what we would call socialism from below. And the third argument is that one of the reasons these struggles didn't go further was the inability and unwillingness of the communist parties in the region, which were actually very large, very significant and influential, but they were steeped in Stalinist politics, and so they failed to lead an independent struggle and instead subordinated themselves to the nationalist project. And this historic failure of the Marxist left in the Middle East has cast a long shadow and is actually one of the reasons for the rise of militant Islamism as a politics of resistance. But the need very much remains for organisations of genuine revolutionary socialism, and we heard this morning, in Egypt we do have, a sister organisation there that has done some incredible work to rebuild some of that politics and organisation. One of the important lessons for today, and many of us are part of the struggle to free Palestine, but there's a warning in this history, and that's that national sovereignty does not in and of itself fulfill the aspirations of the oppressed. And the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, the PA, represents this failure actually, and the sellout of the PLO in compromising with the system. But it's not just an anomaly. It's a product of the fact that genuine liberation requires a systemic struggle against the whole system, not only a fight for a place within that system. As socialists, we unconditionally support the right of oppressed nations to fight for self-determination, fight against imperial rule, by any means necessary, including violence. But we do not turn a blind eye to the different class interests within that fight and the way that leaders of today's national liberation struggles can become tomorrow's oppressors. So if you're feeling tired this afternoon, that's basically the talk. And now I'm just going to flesh out the points with some history and some historical examples. So, as I mentioned, the modern Middle East or Arab world was born out of imperialism. It was during World War I that control of the Middle East, vast oil reserves started becoming crucial for European colonial powers. And actually, Egypt had been occupied earlier by Britain in 1882 because of the strategic possession of the Suez Canal, which actually gave them access to some of their other colonies like India. And in their fight against the Ottoman Empire, sort of Turkey more broadly, Britain and France actually gave false promises of future independence to Arab patriots to sort of recruit them to help them overthrow the Ottoman Empire. But in fact, they had already concluded a secret treaty before the armistice, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they divided up the Middle East amongst themselves. And so Syria and Lebanon became French protectorates, Palestine and Egypt were mandated British territories. And while Palestine was placed under direct British control, in Iraq, for example, they ruled through a sympathetic king, a puppet regime, effectively. Coming out of World War II, a wave of anti-colonial struggles swept the world, and the Middle East was no exception. The imperialist core countries, severely weakened by the war, were struggling to actually hang on to their colonies. On top of that, a world war had just been fought against Nazism, which discredited the sort of legitimacy of colonial supremacist rule. And the Soviet Union was allying itself with struggles against the West. And so all these factors kind of fed in to these independence movements, which actually brought new, independent national regimes to power on the backs of mass uprisings in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. I'm going to look at the cases of Egypt and Iraq in more detail. There's just too much to cover. There's also, a whole very interesting, important history of Iran, of Algeria, but I'm sure people can bring examples into the discussion. So in Egypt, in 1952, the Free Officers Movement overthrew the British-backed King Farouk. Gamal Abdel Nasser was a leading figure in the Free Officers Movement, and eventually, after some internal machinations, emerged as the head of the new regime. And Egypt had been under the thumb of the British. The French also had quite a lot of influence. They owned a lot of the utility companies, which were private. They controlled the Suez Canal through a joint British-French company. In fact, Brits held key posts within the Egyptian police force, and they completely subordinated the Egyptian army to its own. And the Egyptian army was effectively a sham army, like it didn't have even serious weaponry. What happened in Palestine in 1948 was actually massively important in spurring on these independence movements. Because in 1948, the establishment of Israel, the Nakba in full swing with the ethnic cleansing, refugees pouring out. Actually, there were popular mobilizations in Egypt calling on the government to support the Palestinians. But because Egypt was tied up with British imperialism, Britain was in control of mandated Palestine, it didn't want to get involved, it didn't want to send military support. But actually through the Arab League, some volunteer armies did go in to fight Israel. And Nasser himself was actually part of this. But the armies were roundly defeated, and it was very humiliating to them. They had trained, well-established, military powers going in fighting against a fledgling state of Israel that had only just become, just formed a national military. They were effectively Zionist militias just not a few months before. And this defeat actually radicalized a lot of officers within the armies who said, we need a serious military of our own. We cannot continue to just exist as a sham. under the rule of the Britain, and this sort of radicalised them to go back and fight for independence. Now, Nasser, he's sometimes described as the people's pharaoh, and I think this is actually, it captures the contradictions quite well. He, appealed to the aspirations of the masses. He was widely celebrated. He was very popular. He's still very popular. People still, carry his portrait and so on. But he's also a pharaoh, a dictator, and I'll get to that in a minute. But, he said, one of his quotes, they say, "Heaven is for the poor, but don't the poor deserve a share of this world?" He said this to a demonstration of masses of impoverished Egyptians. In power, he instituted land reforms. He took control from the big landowners. He redistributed land to the poor peasants of the Nile. He brought in job security. He introduced social welfare, built up an education and medical system, and won, incredible popular support through that. But, as I said, he was very dictatorial in his rule. He cracked down on the Muslim Brotherhood, rounding up, hundreds. He arrested communists en masse. He even arrested supporters of General Muhammad Naguib, who actually was the leader of the Free Officers' coup, but who wanted to introduce a parliamentary democracy, a multi-party democracy. Nasser was very insistent on a one-party state and was eventually able to win that power battle and round up his supporters. And he crushed independent workers' movements. One of his first acts actually in power was to crack down on a textile workers' strike, try and execute 2 of its leaders. Unionists were, absolutely crushed until, state-controlled unions were introduced, sham unions. And moreover, his defiance of the West, which really is what people look to him for, standing up to the British, nationalising the Suez Canal, which I'll get to as well, but actually many of these stands were forced upon him by circumstances. So in 1955, Israel actually attacked Gaza, which at that time was under Egyptian control. And Nasser didn't want to get into a conflict with Israel, but this sort of left him no choice. So he began to prepare his army. And he appealed to the US for help, but they refused to sell him weapons unless he signed the Baghdad Pact, which was a joint defense agreement of 4 Arab nations and the US, which was essentially aimed at keeping the USSR at bay. But this was against Nasser's policy of non-alignment. And instead he turned to the Soviet Union on the advice of the Chinese, actually. And the USSR was only too happy to help with no conditions attached, because for them this was a perfect opportunity to get a foothold in the Middle East, and so they supplied Nasser with arms via the Czechs, even as he was arresting and imprisoning communists. Again, when Nasser needed a loan to build the Aswan Dam to irrigate farmland, the US left him humiliated when they, offered to help and then retracted. He tried Britain, again, no avail. And this is actually when he moved to nationalise the Suez Canal. Only when all other doors were closed to him, he promised to compensate shareholders. But nevertheless, the effect of this was electrifying. Essentially saying, well, you won't help us, we'll take back our assets and we'll do it alone. And a joint invasion by Britain, France and Israel, which tried to retake the Suez Canal, would have completely crushed the Egyptian army, except that it was aborted actually as a result of US pressure, who were very, very anxious not to give the USSR an excuse to intervene in the region. And so despite the military weakness still of Egypt, this gave Nasser a massive symbolic victory over Western imperialism. People thought it was extremely clever being able to outmaneuver them in that way. And Nasser called these reforms Arab socialism, but most of the capitalist structure actually remained intact, and he copied the state capitalist strategy what we call the state capitalist strategy of Stalinist Russia, which is essentially using state control to impose a program of planned industrialization. State-owned, but not in any way under workers' control, which is why we don't think it's socialism. But ultimately, NASA's project was a failure on both counts in terms of anti-imperialism and in terms of social reform. So in 1967, a war with Israel lasted just 6 days, with several Arab armies combined being rapidly crushed. Within hours of Israel actually mobilizing, almost the entire Egyptian Air Force was wiped out before it even left the runways. It was a devastating blow. This was when Israel took Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. They defeated the Syrians and they took the Golan Heights, and they defeated the Jordanians and took the West Bank and expanded their territory from the initial 1947 petition. Following Egypt's defeat in the 67 war, NASA began actually to make noises towards peace with Israel because, they'd been roundly defeated. There wasn't a lot of choices left open to him. And so while he continued to provide arms and finance to the militant Palestinian organization Fatah, the main group within the PLO, he also advised its leader Yasser Arafat to seek peace with Israel and to certainly aim no higher than a meager Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And in terms of, his social reforms, when Nasser died in 1970, Anwar Sadat took over, making both a much sharper turn towards accommodation with the West. Egypt was the first country to formally recognise Israel's right to exist through the Camp David peace agreement. But he also began an era of neoliberal reform called the Infitah, which began the undoing of the social gains that had been made under Nasser, opened up a period of mass privatisation and cost of living crisis, which then Mubarak took over, and then we have the Egyptian revolution in 2011. But Nasser's rise to power was actually a deflection of enormous popular struggles of workers and students in the decades prior. So a strike wave in the 1940s, for example, fused student demonstrations with workers' strikes, culminating in a huge day of action. In the final crisis, like the final days of the old regime, around 500,000 people marched in Cairo, 250,000 in Alexandria. And the Egyptian Communist Party had roots in the working class. Actually, its predecessor had played a major role in strikes in the 1920s. They played a major role in these strikes in the 40s. And they actually mobilized on the ground against the threat of, the British, French and Israel when they invaded to take back the Suez Canal, to the point of, they organised civil defence committees, they smuggled arms into the guerrilla resistance, and they mobilised thousands of volunteers for military training. So they were no small beer, but they were deeply, deeply confused and divided over Nasser's rise to power. Actually, many of them initially thought it was a fascist dictatorship, but were instructed by the Stalinist Communist Party from Moscow that they were in fact that Nasser was in fact a progressive bourgeois government on a non-capitalist path of development which they should support. And an article in the Jacobin sums up the insanity quite well. Joel Benin writes that in 1959, the Nasser regime imprisoned nearly every Egyptian communist, subjecting them to harsh tortures until their release. Nonetheless, from their desert prison camps, the communists hailed the socialist decrees. And Nasser successfully outmaneuvered the communists by declaring that he had adopted Arab socialism, the communists were supporting Nasser, and so inevitably, they rendered themselves superfluous. What's the point? We don't need a communist party. And in 1965, they dissolved themselves. The other key example I'm going to talk about is the Iraqi Revolution of 1958. And in fact, the failures of the Communist Party are even more pronounced here, as they were they were in a hair's breadth of being able to take power from the nationalist leadership. Although Iraq had formal independence in 1932, in reality British managers ran, Iraq's oil field. The young King Faisal was a product of the British school system, and ran it on behalf of Britain very enthusiastically. All opposition parties were forced underground. Again, the Communist Party's key activists filled the jails, and even the army was deliberately kept short of ammunition in case of mutinies. In the 10 years leading up to the 1958 revolution, Iraq was shaken by growing waves of workers' strikes and protests. At one point, 3,000 oil industry workers occupied one of the pumping stations, elected a strike committee, organised around-the-clock picketing, and a 250-kilometre march to Baghdad. In 1952, there was another uprising, and so, by the time you get to 1958, actually the British-backed monarchy is holding on by, a thread. It's totally isolated, and the Free Officers movement here were able to launch a coup and depose the monarchy in a matter of hours with virtually no resistance, putting in power a man named Abdul Karim Qasim. And significant reforms also followed here. Unions were legalised, 8-hour day, rents cut, social insurance, price cuts, wages went up by as much as 50%, land reforms, and land taken off the elites there as well. But far from ending the revolutionary process, actually in Iraq this was just the beginning of what were huge demonstrations that continued over the next year. The reconstitution of union committees even before they were formally legalised, and the Communist Party won, absolute hegemonic leadership over the trade unions in 1959. And out of all of the communist parties in the Arab world, it was the Iraqi Communist Party that came closest to building a mass revolutionary party and taking power. Underground, they built up to about 1,800 members. After the regime fell, the floodgates were open. At their height, they were 25,000 strong. Their daily paper, they sold 23,000 copies a day. But what happened next was, a tragedy and a disaster. A power struggle emerged between the new leader, Qasim, and his vice president, Aref, who actually wanted to join Nasser's United Republic of Egypt and Syria. But despite him being the one who was actually calling for the nationalisation of the Iraqi oil industry, the communists weren't interested in backing him because they did not want to join the United Arab Republic because, they thought this would be an attack on their new democratic freedoms. And Qasim certainly had no interest in handing power over to Nasser. So a very uneasy alliance formed where the Iraqi communists actually brought out, hundreds of thousands of people in defense of Qasim, calling him the sole leader of the Iraqi revolution, and defending him as the rightful heir of the revolution. And yet when he rejected their demand for seats in government, they retreated very, very quickly. They weren't going to engage in a confrontation with their sole leader. And actually Qasim saw his chance to smash them. So he legalised a tiny rival faction in place of the real Communist Party, mounted an attack on their leadership in the trade unions, banned their publications, sent out hit squads to attack their leaders, and anyone sympathetic to the communists in government were dropped from cabinet. Actually, Qasim didn't stay in power. He was overthrown himself a few years later by the Nationalist Ba'ath Party, who slaughtered communists and destroyed the Iraqi Communist Party. And how did this happen? How did such a powerful force, completely dissolve? Well, the leadership from Russia under the Stalinist influence was, to blame in many ways. They said if they tried to take power, they could expect no help whatsoever from Russia. But they had also made absolutely no political preparations for this. Instead of mobilising peasants and workers to fight for even basic class demands, they mobilised them to fight under the slogans of support for the nationalist regime. And this, it's a historical tragedy, because Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution actually tells us that, these struggles for national liberation can spill over into socialist revolutions, particularly when the working class is playing a leading role, and that potential very much existed and was squandered in both Egypt and Iraq in the 1950s. Many of these regimes that were the object of so much hatred in the Arab Spring this century were themselves descendants of those who came to power in these struggles that I've gone over. Mubarak, as I mentioned, was handed power directly from Anwar Sadat, who himself was handed power directly from Nasser. Gaddafi in Libya, similarly, came to power in a revolutionary struggle in 1969 and stayed in power himself until 2011. Algeria the same, there's many examples. In the Arab Spring saw uprisings from Libya to Tunisia, Bahrain to Iraq, from Lebanon to Syria. City squares were occupied, masses of ordinary people, rose up to demand basic democratic freedoms, end to police states, and, an end to the impoverishment of the free market. And again, the possibilities for a deep social revolution opened up, and again, they were thwarted for political reasons, namely the inability of the working class to take decisive leadership of those struggles. But I think we have to see it as a significant step forward, because actually, an entire generation now has lived through revolution not against imperialist forces, but against their own homegrown capitalist rulers. And the lessons that people learn out of that, stick with you for a lifetime. Just to now wrap up, I want to bring it back to Palestine, which I think is the theme of this weekend. Because in the months since Israel's murderous assault on Gaza, we've seen mass demonstrations break out again across the Arab world. Just this week in Jordan, thousands demonstrated at the Israeli embassy 2 nights in a row, storming police lines. Very, very authoritarian regime. Protests in Egypt, people actually split away from the main state-sponsored demonstration and led their own demonstration for Palestinians back into Tahrir Square, the centre of the 2011 revolution. And we've seen mass strikes in the Mahala textile district with activists actually, workers jailed for that. We've discussed in the last day how Palestine is woven into the revolutionary consciousness across the Arab region, and that the fate of Palestine and the Arab masses are tied together by 1,000 threads. But I think to liberate either, is going to take a revolutionary struggle against those now, corrupted and compliant Arab regimes who, while being legacies of fights against Western imperialism, quickly made their peace with the West, and worse, made themselves rich and powerful off the backs of the sweat and blood of their own people. And for the people of the Middle East, for the people of Palestine, liberation will require a struggle that uproots all of these imperialist and ruling class forces in the region. And to complete that task, we need to see a revival of the politics of socialism from below and of genuine revolutionary organisations.